Good afternoon and good morning. Welcome to the Charlie Mike webinar series hosted by the National Veteran Small Business Coalition. Thank you for joining us today. We'd like to thank our sponsors, BAA Systems and Philips North America, for making this webinar series possible. Okay, a few announcements. We have our charity golf tournament on August 22nd, and we would like to have all golfers attend this event. We had this event last year and we had a great turnout. So if you're a golfer and like to attend this event in Arlington, Virginia, I will go ahead and send you a link and you go ahead and register. And nominations are now open for our first annual Veterans GovCon Awards Gala. We gave out multiple awards. First, our Champions Awards for those government agencies and contractors. Our Veteran Small Business Advocacy Award for that federal agency and the prime contractor. And we award one small business the Gordon H. Mansfield Award. So nominations are still all open right now, and we will send out a link to everybody to nominate their favorite person. Okay, today's webinar is scheduled for an hour and 15 minutes, and it's being recorded. All the recording and the slides will be sent to all attendees by Friday. If you have any questions during this webinar, please type in the right hand of your screen on the control panel. And of course, you guys know me already. I'm Earl Morgan. I'm the program director for the NVSBC, and I would like to welcome our guest speaker today, Lewis Rhodes. He's counsel for McMahon, Welch, and Learned PLC. So, Lewis, the floor is now yours.
All right. How do I take charge? How do I drive?
I'm going to go ahead and give this to you. Hold on for a minute.
All right.
And now you have it.
All right. All right, perfect. Thank you, Earl, and good afternoon for everyone. I guess I should say good morning and good night for people who may watch this after the fact on YouTube. My name's Lewis Rhodes, and to prove my veteran street cred, Earl and I were discussing VA claim statuses and the ridiculousness sometimes of getting your claim in and approved. So not what I do as a lawyer, but if anyone ever wants to reach out, I can point you to some good services that help me along the way. So it's unfortunately a lot of bureaucratic red tape, but I figure that proves my that definitely proves my my veteran street cred when you start talking about VA claims. Okay, so the topic here is hidden traps in an RFP and pre-award protests. If you go out and Google me in webinars, you'll find that I've probably taught this topic about 5 times in the last year. I've taught other webinar topics, but this is probably the only one I teach regularly. To me, it's a very important topic, and a lot of companies have gotten very savvy on bid protests, post-award protests, and are very good at understanding the timelines and when they need to protest. But clients still continually miss pre-award protest issues. I wrote comments on, my client's an intervener, where they won the award, an awesome SDV OSB actually, and they're being protested by a couple other companies. We intervened, and part of my intervention comments was arguing that the protesters' arguments were untimely because they needed to be pre-award protests. About 3 months ago, I successfully helped defend a protest for another client that won an award and was protested. And the number one issue that GAO denied to protest on was a timeliness issue that I briefed in my intervention notes. And that was a very big company that was represented by a very large law firm, and they missed their pre-award protest timing. So this happens still all the time, and it happens to big companies. So it absolutely happens to small companies. GAO, as we'll get into this and we get into the topics, GAO's jurisdiction rules are draconian. If you miss timeliness, if you miss any specific deadline, or if you were supposed to bring an argument in ahead of time and you failed to bring it, they will throw you out. They will throw you out as quickly as they can. There's lots of bid protests filed every year, and GAO loves to slim their docket down as often as possible. And believe me, agencies will not hesitate in filing a motion to dismiss if you bring a late protest argument. So don't waive your protest rights is the tagline at the bottom, and it's exactly that. If you're not on the ball on this topic, you'll end up finding you can't protest at the on the post-award stage. So first, a little bit about my law firm, McMahon, Welch and Learned. We're a boutique law firm in Reston, Virginia. So for those of you in Northern Virginia, we'll be going to the dinner tomorrow night. You can come up and say hi and tell me how awesome my webinar was. And if you do that, I'll buy you a drink, I promise.
Hey, Lewis, can you make your screen a little bigger?
Bigger?
Yeah. There
okay.
it is.
All right, now I can't see my face anymore. So we'll make sure I'm if I do something silly, you can't tell. But anyway, we're a boutique law firm. We're here in Reston, Virginia. We primarily focus on Northern Virginia, DC, Maryland. But I have clients all over the country. One of my best clients is a classmate of mine from the Naval Academy who's got an awesome company that sells medical supplies and devices to the VA, and he's in Pensacola, Florida. Somehow I haven't visited him yet, even though he's in Pensacola on the beach, but we'll figure that out. But in the GovCon space, we can represent people from anywhere in the country. We do a lot of M&A and corporate work as well in the government GovCon. So if you're ever thinking about buying or selling, reach out to us because we have clients who are generally looking to do both. So if you know anyone who's looking to sell a company, give me a call because I know lots of people who want to buy. So that's us. We've been in business for about 10 years. We have 8 attorneys. I was the 8th when I joined in October. And what's awesome about our firm is of our 8 attorneys, 5 of us are veterans. And 2 of the ones who are not veterans grew up in a military household, and the last one is a military spouse. So we understand the military and the veteran community very, very well, as it's near and dear to all of our hearts. So that's us at McMahon, Welch and Learned here in Reston, Virginia. And this is me. So I think I need to update my slide. I think I'm up to 18 years of legal experience now that it's June. Graduated law school in the spring. In that, I've done a lot of time. I started in big law firms. I did that for a while, which was good because I learned a lot of best practices for the big giant firms. I worked on some cases that went up to the Supreme Court even. I left the big firm environment. I went to a small place when I started doing GovCon, and then from there I went in-house for about 7 years. So what I always tell people differentiates me from most lawyers is I was an in-house counsel with small businesses. I've actually priced proposals. I've written proposals. So when I get into a protest angle, I know a lot of things, and more importantly, I can really unpack the pricing spreadsheet, indirect rates, and all the other issues that go with it due to that. I tell people because of my time and all those years as a small business in-house counsel, I kind of developed a broad expertise. So I will always define myself as the lawyer equivalent of an ER doctor. I know a little bit about everything and a lot about some things. And relevant to our crowd here, which I just had to update, I'm a very recent retired infantry officer out of the Marine Corps Reserves. I went to law school after active duty. On June 1st, 2022, I retired after 28 years of combined active and reserve service. Unfortunately, I was a lieutenant colonel, so they kicked me out. They wouldn't let me go all the way to 30, but it was a great run, and it was the best thing I've done in ever. So that's my law firm. That's me. And now we'll get into the topics. And I apologize for my yappy dogs in the background. They'll be quiet here soon. Okay, so pre-award protests. This is the GAO legal definition of a pre-award protest. All right, a protest that challenges the terms of a solicitation. So if there's something in the solicitation that's wrong, that you don't like, that you think is unfair, it has to be brought as a pre-award protest. All right, the GAO regulations, they say, this is quoted right out of the regs. Protests based on alleged improprieties in a solicitation, which are apparent prior to bid opening or at the time set for receipt of initial proposals, shall be filed prior to bid opening or the time of proposals. Okay. Now, if you ever talk to a lawyer, they will all tell you the word "shall" is a very important word in legal vernacular. If it says "shall," it's absolute, right? If you don't file your protest making one of these challenges before the protest, before you submit your bid, then you're going to lose your ability to bring that protest ground. It's a jurisdictional thing, and GAO will say we have no jurisdiction to hear it afterwards. The one important caveat to this section is the apparent prior to bid opening. All right, when you're dealing with pre-award protests and you're dealing with problems in an RFP, they're called defects, and you'll hear latent and patent defects are the terms that you'll use. All right, a patent defect means it's obvious. If the government is asking in one spot that they want a Dell server, and then in another spot they say they want an IBM server, that's a patent defect. Or if they say in one part of the RFP they require people with security clearances in order to do fill a certain labor category, but then you get down into the evaluation or the submission instructions and it says you can submit people without it, or the pricing spreadsheet doesn't address clearances, or they don't ask for a FCL or etc. So something that obviously doesn't make sense in your in the RFP is called a patent ambiguity. A latent ambiguity is just that, right? It's dormant. You can't really tell until the government does its evaluation and gives you your feedback. So the one type of challenge to an RFP you can bring after award is something that's a latent ambiguity. This is often tied to evaluation standards and how the government applies the evaluation and looks at pricing. I think almost universally, I don't believe I've ever run across a latent ambiguity that didn't have to do with an evaluation issue. So those are important words to foot stomp a little bit when you're talking about ambiguities, patent versus latent. If it's patent and obvious, you need to bring it before you submit your bid. If it's latent, you can try to argue it after award. You can always try to argue anything is latent. You're going to mix, you're obviously going to run a risk if you don't bring it as a pre-award protest. But that's always an avenue if you can make a good faith argument that it was a latent defect. And so, patent and latent defects, and one requires pre-award, one you can bring post-award. So, and all right, now this is where a lot of people are like, oh, you're just a lawyer trying to drum up business and get us to protest. And I use this slide as my exhibit A, and that's not really what I'm trying to do. What I'm trying to do here is I'm trying to help solve problems. And you don't really need to get your lawyer involved in here until you get down to step 3 in this process. Your pre-award protest is your weapon of last resort. Okay, you wanna go. Consider this almost like a rules of engagement process, right? I need to shoot flares and make noise and use sparklers and other stuff before I pull a trigger, right? So go all the way back, and your first step in your pre-award analysis is you always want to review a draft RFP and provide comments on it if you can. If the government puts out a draft RFP, you need to read it. And this is your chance to influence the proposal and, or your chance to influence this solicitation. If you think the government's wrong, this is the best. This right there, commenting on the draft RFP, is where you're going to have the most bang for your buck. Because you can go through it. You're the industry expert in your field. So you can look at the terms and you can look at what the government's asking for, and you can tell the government what does and doesn't make sense. So this is always the first step. When I have a client reach out to me about a question in RFP, I always ask them, hey, is this a draft, and is there time to comment? The next step is the Q&A process, and that's always the next question. Hey, is the Q&A process closed? Can you still ask the question? The government always gives you Q&A, and you always have an opportunity to ask the question. Now, there's ways to ask questions and there's ways not to ask questions. And my advice to people is you always, when you ask a question in a Q&A, you want to give the answer to the government as part of your question. You don't want them to figure it out on your own. You want to tell them what the answer is. So if there's an issue on certifications, right, and the government is, hey, I want an ISO 9001 certification. Your question is, since this, and say yours is pending, you ask a question that says something like, will the government, given that the delay between submission of bids and award and performance of the contract, will the government consider an offeror whose application for this certification has been submitted and we're pending final approval and we'll have it before contract execution? All right, you want to like spell it all out for the government on what the answer is. Or if it's a specific equipment buy and the government's like, I need by name Aruba, and that's all I'm going to take. And you can ask the questions like, as the Aruba, as this Cisco product has this, that, and the other capability and is compatible with an Aruba network, will the government consider using this instead of the Aruba? Or, whatever. That's an example. But again, when you ask the Q&A, you want to make sure you it's going to be much more effective if you actually, think through your question and have the answer you want as part of your question. Don't just say, will the government change the requirements? Will the government do this? Say, has the government considered X, and will the government incorporate X into the proposal? Is the best way to do a Q&A. So again, comment on the draft. If there is no draft, make sure you get involved in the Q&A process. Now, say it's late in the game and an opportunity just fell on your lap, or you just discovered it, and or the Q&A is closed, or you asked a really smart question because you paid attention to what I said and the government refused to answer it, or said, yeah, no, we're not going to change that certification and we're going to go forward with it. You ask your lawyer to send an email to the contracting officer on the issue. Oftentimes, an email with a lawyer's signature block that threatens to bring a pre-award protest is going to get a response. I literally just did this yesterday. I did it Friday and got the results yesterday for the client. Normally, I'll never get a response, and I usually bet my clients. I say, I bet you'll hear before I do. I'll send an email in. I'll say, hey, you have a mistake in your solicitation. You're asking for X. X is not legally appropriate. Here's why. If you do not adjust this, we're going to have no choice but to file a pre-award protest. Normally, when the government takes action in response to an email, they don't respond to me, but there's an amendment to the RFP that's put out within a couple days that directly addresses the issue I brought up. Now, what's nice about this step here with an email from an outside counsel is you're anonymous in the whole process. So like I said, my client reached out to me just last week and they sent me, I'll talk more on the specifics in a little bit, but I said, hey, do you want to send an email or do you want me to send it? I said, if I send it, I won't name you. It's completely anonymous and I can be a little more threatening because you don't have to worry about any backlash. And he's like, we take option 2. So I sent a pointed email. I threatened to file a pre-award protest and all kinds of horribles and how I was going to ruin their procurement cycle. And so I sent that on Friday, and on Tuesday, yesterday, Monday, the government issued an amendment to the RFP exactly on the issue that I brought up. So like I said, while that's not 100% foolproof, there's times the agency is going to completely dig in their heels. You will generally, if you have a lawyer who's done this before and knows how to phrase the emails, that's a usually very powerful tool that you're paying an attorney to spend 30 to 45 minutes on an issue instead of filing a pre-award protest. So those are all those are all low level, low issue, low cost things. And your lawyer doesn't even need to get involved until the 3rd. Now, I will say, if it's an important solicitation, and you really, and it's something you really is important to you, and it's a big one, and it's a lot of money, reach out to your lawyer as soon as you see the RFP. When I was an in-house counsel, I read every single RFP we bid, and I read every evaluation criteria of every single one and every instructions to offer before we would bid it. And I would read it as soon as it dropped. And I had many back and forth comments and emails with the government addressing those issues. The earlier you try to intervene, like anything else, the more successful and the lower lift it's going to be. So again, these are your steps. Think about it as a pre-award protest rule of engagement. I'm going to start small. I'm going to then work up to the Q&A. All right, I'm going to get a little more serious, and I'm going to fire a round into your engine block. That's the email from the lawyer. And then if that doesn't work, I'm going all in with the pre-award protest. Pre-award protests on the obviously, lawyers, we're not cheap. That's why I'm at a small firm to make myself cheaper. But a pre-award protest is usually we're not talking dozens of hours. I can probably get a pre-award protest drafted and filed, especially if you've involved me up here in the Q&A and I've seen the RFP already. I could probably churn out a pre-award protest in 5 to 8 hours of total time, depending on how complicated the issue is. And that's being probably overestimating. Once you get your pre-award protest filed, a lot of times the government will then finally cave to what you're saying and make a change. Now, granted, this process that I'm talking about assumes that your position is defensible and legally supportable, that the government's got a mistake in the solicitation and they're trying to steer it to some specific offer and you're catching them in the process. Usually once you get a pre-award protest filed, the government rarely will fight it unless it's a new issue or it's truly up in the air. If you have a pretty strong argument, chances are the government would rather take corrective action up front than have to go through the protest process and drag out their RFP for an extra 30, 60, 90 days. And so this is kind of this. So this is the steps leading up to a pre-award protest. So, all right, now as I call this traps in an RFP, we're going to unpack the RFP here a little bit. This is focused on a FAR Part 15 RFP. Okay, if you're getting a schedule order or you're getting a task order, it's it could be a little different. If it's commercial items, it's going to have different specifications, but that's going to be generally slimmed down, right? The FAR Part 15 RFP is the biggest one with all of the different sections and parts. All right. You've all looked at these multiple times, so you know what the different sections are. Okay, so the ones I got highlighted here are the ones that are the ones you need to pay most attention at, and look at it on don't look at it on how you're going to answer the RFP. These sections we're going to talk about, I want you to look at as, does this make sense? Is the government going kind of off the rails here? Is this make sense? Okay, so section C obviously is a big one, right? That's the one that's going to tell you how you're going to do the job for the government. All right, the other one, all these other ones are really, really administrative for the most part, but you always want to look through them and just make sure it makes sense. Understanding if you're delivery, like what's the, is it FOB delivered? Is it FOB received? What's the packaging instructions? Make sure that, if you are selling a product and you're doing stuff like that, understand that. Also understand inspection and acceptance. What's it mean when the government accepts the goods? I had an issue with a client that got hung up with some PPE because some people were selling the government false and fraudulent PPE. They wanted to come and look hard at my client. Our argument was, hey, we had pretty clear inspection acceptance language in our RFP, and the government inspected the product and accepted them per the terms of the contract. So that was important language. So sometimes that stuff that seems administrivia is actually pretty important. So while it might not be a pre-award protest, make sure you're reading that carefully, especially if you're a small business, because that's where a lot of the gotchas that can come up and bite you really show up in those types of things. So here, the other clauses, contract administrative data, that can be important. Your special contract requirements, your contract clauses, those are generally copied over, right? The government uses them, as I say all the time. Amateurs plagiarize, professionals copy. So the government is no fool. If somebody else is using an RFP, I'm going to take it, dust it off, and use it, and I'm going to use their contract clauses. So take a look through them. I actually just had a pretty contentious issue for a client. It was a commercial items contract, but the government left a lot of contract clauses in there that, including its ability to unilaterally modify the contract, that is not valid under a commercial items contract. That's probably something the client should have caught up front. And we ended up having to spend a lot more time, effort, and money arguing with the government on these mods because it was they used the improper clause. So it's worth spending a little bit of time looking through your contract clauses just to make sure they make sense. Attachments, your reps and certs, all right, and other statements, those are generally coming from you. And then sections L and M, those are where, as a lawyer, where I really make my bread and butter, looking through a proposal and figuring out whether or not it makes sense or whether or not there's errors in the proposal that you really need to address. So those are your sections, and the ones there italicized and in bold, those are the ones you really want to look at, not for how you're going to submit your proposal, but take a step back, look at a critical eye, and judge whether the government's asking for things that make sense and are fair. Okay, so getting into a little bit of the specifics of each one. Now, all right, here's certain things to look for when you're looking through your specifications and your statement of work. All right, improper bundling is a big one. All right, if the government says I want to buy a car and a set of snow tires, absolutely makes sense. If I want to buy some servers and I want to buy the services to install the servers, absolutely makes sense, right? That's not improper bundling. Those are things like like peanut butter and jelly and salt and pepper. They go together. All right. Now, if the government says I want to buy these servers, but I also want to buy like 5 years of high-end cybersecurity services, and I'm going to buy them all together because the people are going to be guarding my servers, that's open for a challenge, because you don't necessarily have to buy your cybersecurity services with the server. So if you see the government doing something like that, that's an immediate tip-off that they want to go to a certain company, and they want to go to a company that does products and services. So so when you look at even though they're both IT, servers and cybersecurity, right? It's all IT, but they're not related. They're not related closely enough where the government can justify bundling them under one solicitation. So the government, like I said, the government can bundle when it makes sense. Think about buying anything. If you're buying products together, it often is easier to go to it's easier to go to Home Depot and buy your wood and your nails than it is to go to one store to buy the lumber and then go to Home Depot to buy the nails. Okay, so government's allowed to do the same thing if it makes sense. They have to go together. It doesn't have to be a perfect match, but the government has to justify it. So if you see the government buying, and the biggest trick usually is in the IT space for products and services that are not directly related to the products. I would say you could probably challenge any product services combined solicitation if the services don't relate to installing the product. If they're follow on and carry on services, I think you can challenge them under improper bundling. So other things to look for, certifications and licenses, okay? I just talked about that a little bit with ISO as an example. I've been very successful in the past for making the argument to the government of, hey, it's gonna take you 6 months to award this. I've got my application in. I can show you proof that I've got my application in. Is that enough to get me through the gate for the proposal submission? And oftentimes the government usually comes back and says yes. If it's a quick turn or a small contract that's not going to take them several months to do the evaluation, they may come back and say no. But my argument is, hey, listen, if we're the awardee and we don't have the certification, you just go to next in line. So by requiring us to have it up front, the language you want to use is you're unduly restricting competition. So the goal is, the government's supposed to encourage as much competition as they can. If they're throwing down certain certifications and licenses that that are easy to get and can be issued within a couple of months, especially if it's something you've already applied for, there's no good reason to exclude you. The other thing to look for is look for certifications and licenses that they don't make sense, right? I'm a lawyer. I got a law license in Virginia and Washington, D.C. Now, if the government says, I'm bidding this work, and the only people who can do this work for the government are people who have a bar license in Hawaii. Okay, that often probably wouldn't make sense. Or, hey, I want these 9 ISO certifications, even though it's not really a production process that they're asking for. So there's no good reason to have ISO certs. Again, as I said earlier, a lot of times the government just takes a existing RFP, dusts it off, and reuses it. So many times certifications and licenses were needed in the previous RFP, and the government forgot to remove them. So look closely and see if they make sense. If they don't make sense, ask. And this is the issue I literally just dealt with last week. It involved an 8A certification. The government asked in the RFP, they said, we need the SBA to certify not your 8A status, your 8A small business status under a certain NAICS code. And my client reached out to me and I said, that's a little odd. I said, ask your boss. All right. And they reached out to the boss, and the email back from the boss, the business opportunity specialist, if you're not in the 8A program, the business back from the SBA's boss, who was their rep, said, we don't give those certifications. So the RFP was demanding something from the SBA that the SBA would not provide. So that was the issue that I sent an email to the government on Friday. I'm like, hey, listen, my client reached out to the SBA, and without naming my client, I cut and copied the response from the SBA boss in my email. I said, here's what the SBA provided, and you're asking for something that I've never seen the government give. The government doesn't certify your size standard. You can get challenged by your size standard under the SBA, but the government won't say in advance that you qualify. It's not something the SBA is going to do. So that was they wanted an 8A certification from the SBA that the SBA doesn't do. So that was an absolute perfect example for how you go to the government and say, hey, this doesn't make sense. Now I totally get what the government was trying to do. What the government wanted to do is they probably got burned by awarding to a company that lost the size protest after award. So the government was trying to protect itself up front. Absolutely makes sense. And in a perfect world, we could have complied with it. But, as the SBA wasn't willing to do it, we had to go to the government and say, hey, we need you to fix this. I can't be, and this was an issue of compliance. What they said in the RFP, if you did not provide that certification of your size status under that NAICS code, they were not going to move you to phase 2 of the review. So this was a hit or go home. So that's why we took it seriously and challenged the government on that. And that was, the government came back and they probably independently fact checked me with the SBA, but they came back and issued a mod and changed that. The only thing they want is to make sure you're a valid 8A company as part of your submission. So there's a success mark in my ledger. Other things to look for outside of that are restrictive or specialized equipment, right? If they, you see this a lot in the IT space. I only want to buy this exact type of thing, and the government has to be able to justify when they want to do that. Excuse me. I'm plugging RWB out here in the process. If you're not familiar with them, they're worth checking out. But if the government, the government can't defend restrictive or specialized equipment, that's something else you can challenge. Now, sometimes the government can do this. I had an issue with another client. They were the only authorized distributor for a certain type of medical device that processed a certain COVID test. And the VA had bought that type of COVID test. And my client's like, hey, they submitted their bid, and they said we're the only one who has a distribution agreement with this company. The government didn't like it, but that was an authorized commercial contract between a distributor and a company. Now that company also, my client did a lot of work to help introduce the product to the government. Part of their payoff is they had an individual distribution agreement. So that was an issue, and not just because it was my client, because we ultimately prevailed on that. The government agreed, but that was an issue where you could require a specialized equipment because they had already bought all these tests, so they needed something that could process the tests. So there you go, you had to buy that thing that could process that type of test. The government painted itself into a corner there. But a lot of times in the IT stuff, they may say, hey, I want this thing from HP, because a really good HP outside sales guy has been burning up the government's phone, coming in demos and showing him how their Aruba equipment is the best thing since sliced bread, and you really want to buy this. So they may ask for Aruba because, hey, that looks great, and maybe there's no justification for it, right? It said, I know how to spell IT. That's about as far as it goes. So I couldn't tell you what is justified and what's not, but look for that. If you're seeing the government ask, if it's your industry and your industry and the government's asking for something, and you're like, that does not make sense. I need a left-handed wrench, and I'm only going to buy a left-handed wrench. You'd be like, wait a minute, that doesn't make any sense at all. Unusual performance requirements are another thing. If you have a standard way that things get done in your industry, whether it be the way you build a building, the way you perform IT services, the way you do an audit, anything, and the government changes the rules or does something outside of the norm, that should raise your antenna a little bit, and you should query the government about it. Every once in a while, the government absolutely has a justification, but a lot of times they don't. And any of you guys in the BD industry out there, if you see these things, restrictive or specialized equipment or unusual performance requirements, you need to find whoever the BD guy was who was influencing the government and go hire them. Because generally that's a sign of a very successful, business development guy who was in with the government in their ear at trying to influence the solicitation, right? And it's absolutely legitimate, and every good company does it. But you only should go to there's a certain extent you can go to. You can't make it so restrictive that only one company is able to submit the bid. So those are all things that you need to pay attention to as you're getting ready to put together your RFP. And the basic rules, like look for anything that looks like it's designed to restrict competition. All right, maybe the incumbent has a certain type of certification, and it's a rare certification, and the government likes its incumbent and wants to give them a leg up, so it's going to require that certification, even though that certification isn't really necessary. All right, that's anything like that, anything designed to restrict competition. I only want companies that are in the I'm doing work at the Pentagon, and you have to have your company headquarters in the 22207 zip code in North Arlington, otherwise I won't hire you. Okay, that's ridiculous. All right, those are ridiculous examples, but sometimes you use ridiculous to prove your point. Anything that's ambiguous. If the government is putting out specifications and you can't figure out what the government's asking for, that's something to push back on. And one of the examples I have of a GAO opinion at the end of this presentation was just that. The government said, "Oh, I need a help desk," and it was your guess on how many trouble tickets. They didn't tell you. "Oh, I need a help desk for 50 users." But no historical data was provided, nothing that would allow a bidder to put in an educated bid. which means that you're either going to overbid by a ton, or you're going to get yourself in trouble by underbidding and having a contract that you're going to lose your shirt on. So, restrict competition, anything ambiguous, and anywhere the government is inconsistent in what it's asking for. If in one section it asks for a certain type of equipment and in another section it asks for another, raise your hand and say, hey, this doesn't make sense. Or if it's asking for a certain certification in one spot, but a different one in another spot, again, you want to raise your hands and say, hey, I'm writing software here, so this ISO code, ISO one you're asking for isn't applicable. It should be this other ISO cert, something along those lines. And again, always look at this with always look at these a lot, except for the restricted equipment. But I usually look at this as the government is reusing an old RFP or somebody else's RFP, and they just missed something when they cleaned up and reissued a new one. So, a lot of times the government doesn't realize these things are out there. So that's why, it puts out a draft RFP for you to comment on to identify all these. And if they didn't put out a draft RFP, that's your spot to, that's your spot in the Q&A to point out to the government where it's wrong. So, a lot of times you're going to have a lot of success in these issues on that part. And if the government is being a little cagey and is trying to steer it towards a certain company, when you send a Q&A or a comment on a draft RFP that catches them with their hand in the cookie jar, they usually will sheepishly amend the RFP. And it's not a game because there's a lot of money at stake for y'all, but a little bit it is gamesmanship, where the government knows who they want and they're trying to influence it, and you catch them and they're like, okay, we'll fix that and change it. So, okay, section L, this is the next section where you're going to see some issues in an RFP that you're going to want to address. Not super common in instructions to offerers, but it could exist. It's 2022, and if the government says you need to mail me, 5 binders and you need to send me 6 copies of each binder for my evaluation team, I would raise your hand on that, especially if it's a small business set aside. That's a lot of money. And while that was part of the cost of doing business, back when I first started doing government contracts, like I said, it's 2022. The government doesn't need hard copies of your proposal in, 7, 8, 9 copies of it for their evaluation team. So if they're giving you instruction to offers that don't make sense or look like they're trying to be onerous, so no new companies are going to jump in and it's going to limit the people who are bidding. That should be your red flag in the instruction to offers. And just so read through them, just make sure that everything it makes sense. And if the government tells you you have to submit a bid to a certain email, and then somewhere else they have a different email, or they have 2 different times or whatever, I think everyone on here knows to look for those things and clarify them. But absolutely make sure you clarify them, because if there's 2 email addresses out there for submissions and you submit it to the wrong one and the government says, sorry, your proposal's untimely, well, you lost your ability to protest because that was a patent ambiguity and you should have challenged it up front. Now, granted, the government would have answered that if somebody asked, but pay attention to those kinds of things. So that's it on the instructions offers. That's pretty cut and dry. All right, section M. This is really where, outside of restrictive requirements, this is really where you're going to get your most pre-award protests. And because this is usually where the government will dig its heels in, because it feels like its evaluation criteria is perfect, and how dare you challenge me? But this is important. And here again, I talked up front about latent versus patent ambiguity, right? If the government has an evaluation scheme that says you need to offer me discounts based on X, Y, and Z, and you provide those discounts, but the government then, when it does its price evaluation, doesn't factor those discounts into the price evaluation, that's a latent ambiguity. you had no idea that the government wasn't going to apply the discounts, and you maybe you priced high up front and offered big discounts because that was your strategy for winning the work. But if the government if the government doesn't take the discounts into account, then that's a latent ambiguity, and you can challenge it. And that's a error in an RFP. That is a post-award challenge. Now, if the government says you have to offer me discounts based off of volume of buy, and my historical volume of buy is above the discount number, and then you get into the price evaluation, and the government says we're not going to apply any of the discounts when we factor your price evaluation. If they tell you they're not going to, that's a patent ambiguity, and you need to challenge it up front. Right? If the government's requiring you to price discount, and then they're not going to factor in your discount into their price evaluation, that's wrong. They can't do that. They need to factor that in. If they tell you they're not going to do it, you better protest before you submit. If they don't tell you and then they do it and you find out in your debrief, then you protest after the fact. That's probably one of the best examples of how a latent versus patent ambiguity work in practice. So that's those are, and again, do not waive your protest arguments. All right. If something in the evaluation factors look off, what I tell people is send it to me and let me take a look at it, and I'll tell you whether or not it makes sense. I've been doing this a long time. If you go to any protest attorney, if you work with any attorney who does protests, it's if you're going to spend, $15,000, $20,000, $25,000 submitting a proposal, it's probably worth you spending an hour of legal fees to have your attorney make sure there's nothing wrong with the RFP and the evaluation criteria or otherwise. So, I said I'd factor that in as part of your B&P costs to make sure you're not wasting your time and money. All right, it's expensive to put a proposal together. All right, other parts on evaluation criteria, an unreasonable evaluation method. All right, if the usually this gets tied to price or cost. We just talked about a perfect example on discounts. Or hey, you're going to give me labor rates, and you're going to give me labor rates, and I'm not going to need the full year of labor rates, but I'm going to evaluate your price on a full year of 2080 hours anyway. Or I'm going to, I'm only going to pick certain labor categories and weigh them. Or if it's not or I'm only going to look at your overhead costs. Now if it's a if it's a SC&A type Service Contract Act contract, maybe the government can only look at what you're putting on as your wrap and overhead. But they have to if they're not looking at the whole price, that's part of it. The evaluation method also it can't be unreasonable, irrational, or result in a misleading result. That's Department of Redundancy department there. I'm giving this 6 times and I keep forgetting to fix that sentence. Result in a misleading outcome. Let's try that. All right. So if the government says, I want you to propose, X number of labor categories, as well as, your technical solution, but all I'm going to look at is the quality of the individuals, not your management approach. All right, if the government asks you to submit something and says you need to explain X, Y, and Z, and if you don't explain X, Y, and Z, they're not going to evaluate you. That's a unreasonable result. All right, misleading outcome. If the government's not evaluating the entire proposal submission and they can't justify why they're not, you can challenge that, and you can challenge that for being irrational or having a misleading outcome. So again, look at your evaluation methods closely, and I can't remember if I have another one on. Yes, look at that. I have 3. This is how important the evaluation factor section is in the RFP. All right, ambiguous evaluation criteria. All right, if I tell you I'm going to rate you, outstanding, very good, and average or acceptable, I need to kind of give you a definition of what those entail. I can't be completely, I don't have to be in nauseating detail, but I have to say, outstanding means you have at least 3 strengths and no weaknesses or deficiencies. And good means you have at least 1 strength and you could have 1 weakness, whatever. However they define it, they got to give you a little bit of the parameters of how they're going to score the game. All right, they can't just say, hey, we're going to rate offerers on outstanding, very good, good, and adequate. All right, they need to explain why. If they're going to give you a point rating or a scoring system, they need to explain to you how they did it. Right? They got to basically they got to tell you the rules of the game before you start playing. How are factors compared and related? This is an important one, right? Is what happens at the end? I'm sure you've all seen it 100 times. Technical approach is more important than past performance. Taken together, all non-price factors are substantially more important than price. Okay, look for that in your RFP. Now here is, I've been doing this for a long time, and actually I just found this out about 6 months ago. If the government does not put that in an RFP, it doesn't mean the RFP is flawed. It means all the evaluation factors, all the technical factors and price factor are all treated equally. So if you have an RFP that doesn't say which is more important and how they rate, then each one is equal. And if the government on the backside turns around and says, oh, I rate a technical approach more important, and he was better than you were, so that's why he won. That again, if we were live and you could ask, I'd ask a question. That's a latent ambiguity, right? So again, if the factors aren't compared, they're all equal. If the government doesn't apply them equally, there's your post-award protest round on a latent ambiguity. But what I encouraged my client when I found this issue out 6 months ago is I said, hey, go ask the government to make sure that, and again, I'm going to go back to the beginning and say on the Q&A, if you have a Q&A that says it gives the government the answer, the government is more likely to give you the right response. So the question of the government was, under the FAR, under FAR provision, blah, 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 if the government doesn't dictate, then each factor is considered to be equal. Can the government confirm that it intends each of these factors to be evaluated equally? That was the question we asked in so many words. The government came back, amended the RFP, and said no, technical approach is more important. So we probably avoided a problem and a potential post-award protest because we asked the question up front. Because even though it's valid to not describe it, if I would treat something that didn't describe it as ambiguous, and I would ask a question on it. You can't bring in a pre-award protest because the government's allowed to not say how they're compared, but I would still ask a question and try to clarify that issue because it's it could lead to a problem down the road if a lot of times the government's probably intending to factor one better than the other, but sometimes again the government gets busy like the rest of us and they forget. So again, there's no mystery as to why I use 3 slides on evaluation factors. Like I said, that's the most logical place you're going to see a protest, or you're going to see a pre-award protest rising up, and that's where the government is often going to dig their heels in and not give and if you try to challenge, because it's a little harder to quantify what's ambiguous. Sometimes that can lead to a fight. But that's those are the issues there. And here's a free 2-minute legal lesson on actually an active protest I have right now that involved an opinion that was issued out called Grant Thornton a few years ago. And this was an issue. This was a pre-award protest issue that involved a GSA mass buy. The government was buying it off GSA schedule, and the requirements said you need a certain amount of experience for each labor category in order to bid the work. And Thornton, who was the one who protested on that protest, their labor categories said if you have accountant 1, say, accountant 1 must have a bachelor's degree or at least 6 years of experience. and maybe Grant Thornton's labor category said a bachelor's degree or 4 years of experience. With that, so Grant Thornton filed a protest and said those extra, by eliminating people whose labor categories had less experience, the government was overly restricting competition for the bid. And Grant Thornton won that protest. So, and the GAO came back and said, listen, they're allowed to, those are called minimums for a reason, and an offeror is allowed to increase increase the experience beyond the minimum of their labor category. So you can't pick a number arbitrarily and then throw out everyone who has a minimum below that floor. Now you have to propose at the floor or above, but you're allowed to bid even if your labor categories do not meet necessarily the minimums. And that's that was like I said, that issue is alive in a protest I'm addressing currently. So it's not one I had run across before. So this was something I've been doing this for 17 years, and I still run across certain arguments and protest grounds that I hadn't seen. But that is I figured that's a good free lesson for people who hold a GSA schedule. When you look at an opportunity, say, oh, they say that, I have to have 10 years experience in that labor category. Mine always has 8. You can still bid it. They can't shut you out of the opportunity. And if they, but if you do bid, you have to just make sure you're meeting the requirements, whether your labor category is lower or not. So that was an actual pre-award protest. That was a very successful one, and Grant Thornton ended up winning that. It was an interesting read because Grant Thornton protested, they got added, they won the contract, and then they were protested for being an improper awardee, and GAO ruled in their favor again, and they got to keep the work. So it was a pretty interesting. If you're a dorky lawyer, stuff like that is always fun to you. So, but that's a real life example of how these evaluation factors and criteria and requirements can be at play. And to me, that was a pretty creative challenge by Grant Thornton's attorneys to say, hey, you have a right to bid this, and here's the argument we should make. So, and for some other examples out there, here's 2 actual other cases that I pulled out of GAO. Raymond Express International. I kind of gave this one away earlier when I was talking about it, but this was selling to the commissary and selling food to the commissary overseas. The solicitation required pricing discounts, right? If we buy X amount of anything, you have to give us a discount on the price. The agency, when it did a price evaluation, didn't factor in the discounts. All right. Protest challenged it. He said it was ambiguous, and it led to a misleading evaluation. And it was a post-award challenge because it was a latent defect. It was latent in that the government didn't say it wasn't going to provide the discounts in the price evaluation. So, and Raymond Express won that protest. That was sustained. All right, ASRC, Federal Data Network. All right, ASRC, Arctic Slope, one of the big Alaska Native corporations. This was, again, they were trying to bid for a help desk, and the PWS did not give them enough information to process the level of effort. Now, this could be help desk, this could be facilities maintenance, anything that's a service contract. If the government doesn't tell you how much, if it's an existing contract that's out there now, and this is a follow-on contract, you have a right to demand that the government give you stuff that you can figure out the level of effort. It's a brand new opportunity. The government doesn't know, and everybody's shooting blind. But if there's an existing contract and they've had 5 years of help desk services, the government can tell you what the average monthly trouble tickets are for the help desk. And if the government doesn't, that means it wants the incumbent to win, and you absolutely need to challenge that up front and call the government on it. So again, this was surprising that went all the way to a protest, because most times the government, when the government gets called out on that, they'll usually cave and provide the information. But this went all the way to an opinion, and GAO held for the protester and said the government was not providing enough information to allow people to make an informed bid. You have a right to make an informed bid, and if the government has the information, they have to share it. So those are, you know, I talked to a couple other, you know, I had some, you know, real war stories earlier. These are other cases that are out there, GAO opinions. The Grant Thornton case that I just came across this week and during work. That's another opportunity, another example. Like I said, this happens a lot, and you know, I've had too many times in my career where I've had to tell a client, I'm sorry, you needed to bring this protest pre-award, and you waived your protest grounds. And that really sucks to have to tell a client who's got a very good protest argument that we can't bring it because it was required to go be a pre-award protest. So don't have that conversation with me or your attorney. You know, make sure you look through this stuff closely, look for these issues. And again, as I said, you know, it doesn't take, if you send me an RFP and said, hey, can you look through this and see if anything looks squirrely? You know, you're talking an hour of my time. You know, and that's a fraction of what you're going to spend putting a solicitation or putting a proposal together. So, you know, if you don't have an in-house attorney or you don't have a very experienced contracts person who can look at it from that kind of lens, again, although I would recommend talking to an attorney who does protests, because if I know how I'm going to fight this thing, I can spot it usually in the solicitation. Any protest attorney can do the same. You know, if you're going to spend a lot of time and effort and money going after a bid, I would take a hard look at it. I have one client that's fantastic at this. This is the one that just came up with the 8A certification. He usually sends me an email and he's like, hey, Lou, I looked through this RFP and this looks really weird. Can you look at this section and tell me what you think? I spend 15 minutes and I get back to him and I say, hey, here's what I think. And here's what I think you should put in your, if Q&A is still open, here's what I think you should ask the government. Again, 15, 20 minutes, and it avoids a bigger problem down the road. So again, to me, this is a very smart use of an ounce of prevention. And you know, if you look at an RFP and it looks like, and you're like, damn, I can't bid that, but I should be able to bid that. That requirement's BS. You know, that's another time to fact check it. Now, I'm not a technical expert. That's up to you to be able to tell me, or any attorney, but you know, we absolutely can tell you if you can justify why it's overly restrictive, we can go to the government and argue on it. So with that said, here's how you find me to ask me all these brilliant questions so I can give you all the great answers. So that's my info. I'm here in Northern Virginia. And for those of you who are local and are going to be going to dinner tomorrow night, I look forward to seeing you all. And with that, I am going to turn off my screen. I think
off your screen.
My stop sharing my screen.
Okay. Okay, great. Thank you so much. Okay, it's time for you to ask some questions. So go ahead and type them in the control box, and now we'll ask away. So the first question I have is, do I need an attorney for this process? And if so, when should I ask for one?
Okay, yeah, no, that's a good question. And again, it's like I said, I always try to recognize that lawyers are not cheap. Now I have a personal practice of not billing my clients to death. And if you run something past me that's a 6-minute question, chances are I'm not going to bill you for it. You know, unfortunately, not everybody in my profession takes the same. I would put it on a sliding scale and say the more important this RFP is to you, the earlier you should get it in front of an attorney to take a look at it. You know, if it's a small, low dollar one and you're not going to spend a lot on the proposal, then go ahead and just look through it yourself. But again, like anything else, you know, it never hurts to have a professional weigh in on something. Just, you know, the important thing to understand is this is not, if you send an RFP to an attorney and ask him to review it, you're not going to get a $5,000 legal bill. And if you do, you need to fire that attorney and find another one. If you send me an RFP and ask me to look for it, you'll look through it, you'll get a couple $100 legal bill.
Great. Okay, next questions. Does this apply to the task order opportunities below the protected threshold?
Yeah, now that's a very good question, because you know, a lot of times you don't know what the threshold, what the size of an opportunity is going to be in a pre-award context. And if you're not familiar with that topic, the issue is The issue is task orders. If you have a MAC contract or you're bidding off of a schedule, you can only protest civilian agency task orders over $10 million. You can only protest DoD task orders over $25 million, right? This is part of the Federal Acquisition Streamlining Act from back in the 1990s. Basically, the government's tired of getting protested to death. Now, you can always ask Q&A and questions and otherwise up front. It can be a $10,000 opportunity. You can still ask a question. The government has to be, and a lot of times, as I said, a lot of times the government just is not, the government didn't deliberately make the mistake. A lot of times it's a mistake. So you're always free to involve and ask. Now, if it's a bigger opportunity and it gets to the pre-award protest side, you get into a shade of gray where the government can't really argue. Now, if it's clearly a $1 million or $2 million effort, the government's probably going to pull the jurisdiction issue. But if it's a bigger opportunity and you're looking at a bid that's 8 million, maybe it gets to 10. You're not sure because you haven't priced it yet. You could probably protest that and survive a challenge. So the government, the smaller the opportunity, the more games the government can get away with because you can't protest them. But always remember you have other opportunities to avenues like your small business advocate, your OSDBUs. I can give a whole riff on why OSDBUs should always be your first call when you have a problem with the government, but that's another topic. So even if it is too small to do anything on the protest front, you still have avenues. OSDBUs and the SBA is another one you can flag and say, hey, they're playing games with small businesses.
Great. Here's a good question. I got a question from Norris Middleton. How do you handle an inadequate debrief that is not accordance with the FAR?
Well, if it's a FAR Part 15 issue now, there's new regulations out there that have actually codified now the requirement for the post-award debrief. All right, so the DoD does this, and I think most civilian agencies are doing it now too. So when you finish, now if you have a DoD opportunity, and that includes anybody, I just did this with NGA 3 weeks ago. You send a list of questions after your debrief for the government to answer. And the government the government is supposed to answer those questions. And if the government doesn't answer those questions, I've used a lack of responses to help form my protest argument and be like, the government's failure to provide this information shows me that the government's hiding something. And a lot of times the government is not hiding something. And whenever I get in front of a contracting officer, I always have this exact same conversation. Less information leads to more protests, not the other way around. The government has this assumption that the more I tell you, the more likely you are to have a protest ground. At every opportunity, I argue just the opposite to the government. So, but again, this is an issue where, the government may be afraid because if they tell you too much, you're going to protest. I would include that stuff in your enhanced debrief questions. If it's a DoD entity, they absolutely have to follow the enhanced debrief procedures. Civilian agencies do not, but several of them are. So if you're not getting a proper and adequate debrief, that's the avenue. And again, you can send this, and I got to be careful how I say this because you can always engage with the agency after your debrief, whether it's an enhanced debrief process or not. You can go to an attorney and say they haven't told me this, and the attorney can send a letter and be like, you're required to do this, that, and the other thing under the FAR. That does not stop or change your protest deadline. So if you do that, you do complain and send an email back or a letter back, make sure you're still counting your days to understand your 4 days after your protest for a SICA stay and 10 days for GAO jurisdiction. So that's but that's the government does that a lot under a misguided belief that helps prevent protests. So whenever you talk to the government, always tell them the more information you give me, the less likely I'm going to be to protest, because if you don't give me the information, I'm going to assume you're hiding something, especially if I'm a veteran, because by hardwired things, I don't trust the big government at all, and I'm going to assume you're lying to
me. Great. Okay, we still have time for some more questions. Wait for them to come in. Lewis, anything you want to add before we end this webinar?
No, I said this is a topic very near and dear to my heart. You know, if you have any questions on it, feel free to reach out. They said especially if you're a veteran or a veteran-owned company, you know, I'm not churning the meter on anybody. You know, I understand small businesses. I understand budget constraints. And what I tell when a small company reaches out to me and says, "Hey, I help, but I can't afford to spend a lot of money," I'm like, "Listen, when you're a $30 million a year company, I want to be your lawyer. So I'm not going to nickel and dime you now and rack up massive legal bills. I want to work with you and help you grow and help you be successful, because I want to do that for you, because I want to help you grow, and I want you to tell all your friends how awesome I am." So it's a great. I do much better in my practice by treating my clients right. And if you see this webinar and you have a quick question, and it's going to take me 5 or 10 minutes to answer something for you, I'm not going to throw an engagement letter out and charge you a bill. Like I said, I legitimately like helping veterans. We all like to work together. We all like to help each other. That's what NVSBC is all about. So you know, you always have it's almost like a coupon for free advice at least one time.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay. Again, the slides and the recording of this presentation will be sent to you by Friday. So we're going to be working on that right now. Lewis, thank you so much for doing this presentation. Unfortunately, I won't be at the dinner tomorrow, but some people will be. So if you go to the dinner tomorrow night at in Washington, D.C., just look up Lewis and he'll be happy to talk to you.
That's right. If you saw this webinar and tell me how good I did, I'll buy you a drink. I can promise you that.
Okay, you did good. So you have to buy me a drink when I see you next time.
Absolutely, I got you.
Okay, buddy. Thank you so much. Just look out for the email about this webinar on Friday. But until then, this is Earl Morgan signing off, and I'll see you next time on Charlie Mike.
Hoorah.
Take care.
Bye.